Objective markers are a staple for most tabletop wargames, each having their own purpose and rules associated to them, but generally speaking they allow you to score the game as it progresses. And in this video we're going to be looking at how we can make our own objective markers for our tables to make it that little bit more immersive. So, let's get those points on the board and hold the line for the roll. Most of you will have seen these objective markers before, either small circular discs that you then measure out from, or larger neoprene mats that cover the full radius of your objective that are custom in their design. Now these neoprene mats, they tend to stand out a little bit too much for me, and the small circular discs having to measure out from can be a bit of a pain sometimes, having to get your tape measure right into that bottom section to measure that base and just have that small inkling of whether it meets or not. Now what we're going to be doing today is building our own objective markers that fit with the style of our board, cover the full radius of what we need an objective marker to do, as well as adding a little flair from a previous video. Now my game of choice is 40k, so I'm going to be using the dimensions from the objective markers from that game particularly in this build, but you can easily adjust to fit whatever game type you prefer. I do want to preface this build with one caveat, and the fact that these are going to be used just for your home games or your club games, in that these are variants of the objective markers just for the sole purpose of making the tabletop much more captivating. In this build we're going to be covering two of the most common environments that we see on the tabletop, industrial and urban. So to get started we're going to need the following materials. For our industrial build we'll need 2mm thick cardstock, 225 to 250 GSM cardstock, cardboard straws or piping, spare sprues, cheap jewellery beads, and wire mesh. For our urban build we'll need 2mm cardstock, cork sheeting, and modelling compound. Materials we'll need for both builds will be PVA glue, hot glue, sealer and paints. Now the sealer itself is made from 1 part isopropanol alcohol, 1 part PVA glue, and 5 parts water. All the materials are linked in the description below. If you do use the links in the description to buy your materials, you'll help out the channel, which will mean so much. And it doesn't cost you anything extra, so why not? The first thing that we're going to want to do is to make sure that we have the right measurements for our objective markers. For 40k, the main objective marker base is 40mm, and then a 3-inch radius that it then extends out. So, if we take half of the 40mm base and add 3 inches to that, we get the true radius of our objective markers. So rather than making this complicated, the one thing you're going to need to know is that the true radius of our objective markers is going to be 96mm, or 3 13/16 of an inch, depending on how you wish to measure it. Take the compass and measure out the radius, but reduce this by a touch, a millimetre or 2 at most, giving us a slightly smaller circle than our objective marker needs to be. We want to mark out our slightly smaller circle on the 2mm thick cardstock. This will give us the base for both of our builds, either industrial or urban. Now, we'll start with the industrial build, but if you want to skip to the urban, jump to the timestamp on screen. Also, whilst we're here, go ahead and click that like and subscribe button. It helps the channel out massively and doesn't cost you anything at all. The next thing that we want to do is mark out some basic shapes for our objective marker to show how it's going to look. For this, there's no set rules. Just design something you think will look good and will work well on your objective marker. For me, I like the quartered panel look, so I'm just going to be splitting it into quarters with the view of cutting out 2 sections and then leaving a circular panel in the middle with little sections that extend out to break up those lines. To then add to the panel effect, take the 225 to 250 GSM cardstock and use the compass to draw out a full-size objective marker on it, remembering the radius of 96mm. This cardstock is easily cut with scissors, whereas the thicker cardstock will need to be cut with a craft knife, and so it's probably going to create some rough edges. Using the 225 GSM cardstock on the top and being slightly bigger will cover those rough edges really nicely. Now that we have 2 circles, one slightly bigger than the other, on our 225 GSM cardstock, trace out another circle on the inside to give us a ring that's around 20 to 25mm in thickness. We can then also trace out another circle on the inside with sections that come out the same as our 2mm cardstock, but once again being a little bit bigger to hide all of our cut marks. Now that we have everything traced out, let's get to cutting. And through the magic of editing, voila, all done. Our results will look a little something like this. No industrial piece will be complete without wire mesh being used to act like metal platforms. Taking the wire mesh, cut out triangular sections that will then cover the holes that we made on our 2mm cardstock. Don't worry too much about being super clean and precise, as our 225 GSM cardstock is going to look to cover up those lines and edges. Scissors will work fine to cut the mesh as it's quite thin. We then use hot glue to pin the mesh into place, making sure to flatten out the glue as much as possible. Once in place, we can then start to glue our 225 GSM cardstock to cover the edges and give our piece the effect of panels. Add 2 more strips of 225 GSM cardstock across the 2 axes to cover up the last sections of wire mesh. Now that we have our basic industrial marker, let's add a little something extra just to draw it together. Spare sprues are great for adding that little bit of extra detail from spare material that would normally just be thrown away. Cut out sections that you think will work from the sprue, clean and file them down so we can add them to the build. You can also then add small cardboard tubing to act as pipework on these industrial builds. Other greebles like craft wire, 3D printing supports, and any other spares that you've collected over the years and shoved in your spares box will work really well. Just go nuts and add whatever you think will work. This can all be glued down with hot glue. We can also add some cheap crafting jewellery beads to act as little light relays that we can paint up later to really draw the piece together. Next, we need to add a thin layer of PVA glue on top, just to act as a sealer between the board and the paint that we're now going to put on. The last thing that we need to do is prime and paint. Sticking with the grey, black, silver and copper colour palette will really bring the industrial look together. Basing the model in a black and then highlighting in a grey will give us a good place to work from. Following this, dry brush on the silver and the copper colours to draw out that metallic look. Adding in additional details such as hazard striping and additional transfers from old sheets will really bring this piece together. And finally, we should end up with something that looks like this. Moving on to our urban objective markers, we start off in the same position with a circle of the 2mm cardstock that we used previously. The first thing that we want to do is get an idea about how we want to design our objective marker. In this instance, I like the idea of having concrete craters that have been caved in by exploded ordnance, or roadways that have crumbled and broken due to the never-ending onslaught of tank tracks and heavy vehicles that stalk the city streets. Making concrete craters also has an additional benefit, is that these pieces can also be used as terrain cover as stated in the rulebook. Firstly, taking the cork sheet, tear off sections that will be used as flat pieces of asphalt that are still intact and will be placed randomly on the objective marker. Next is where things can get a little bit messy with the modelling compound. Place the 2mm cardstock base onto a sheet of baking paper, parchment paper, greaseproof paper, whatever you have, and using a gloved hand, spread the modelling compound over the objective marker, building the edges up higher to make our crater in the centre. Remember that our 2mm cardstock base was a couple of millimetres short for the radius, so going over the edges with the modelling compound will be fine just to give us a smooth transition to the ground whilst not exceeding the diameter limits for our objective marker. Remember to work in small sections and quickly with modelling compound, as the working time is quite short. Whilst still wet, add the sections of cork to build up the flat surfaces. Once dry, we can then really firm up the piece by giving it a layer of PVA glue to really strengthen the piece completely. Considering how much we're going to be handling these and that the Mini is going to be constantly placed on and off the piece, we want to make sure that it can stand up to a little heavy-handedness if needed. Whilst the PVA glue is still wet, you can add sand or tile grout to the piece to add additional texture and then lock it in with the sealer solution. Now leave the piece to fully dry. We want to make sure that it's rock solid before we move on to the next stage, as we're going to be adding paint now, which will then create more moisture and could then seep into the piece, which we want to make sure that barrier layer is there to protect us against. Prime the objective marker in a muted grey to give us our base colour, and we can then add additional highlights through either dry brushing or normal painting with a lighter grey or white. Other additional flourishes can be added, such as pools of water using a resin water effect, or making broken street signs. Now we could finish there. We have a very good objective marker that we can use on our tabletops. However, I'd like to go one step further. In a previous video, I showed you how to make tabletop banners for your faction of choice using super cheap house art items and spare transfer sheets. Link here. Now these banners can be used on your buildings and other terrain pieces, but they can also be used to show who controls objective markers. My friends and I have been using these in our games for quite a while now and we absolutely love it. Now it's just so satisfying to place down a banner to show that you control an objective marker, and even more satisfying when you make your opponent remove theirs to show that you control that objective marker as you take it over. Now I showed you how to make the banners in a previous video, but the posts themselves that they sit on are really simply just made from barbecue skewers that are painted. The tops of mine have 3D printed greebles stuck to them, but if you don't have a 3D printer, just cut the top off and use the excess of the barbecue skewer as a top runner that your banners can then sit on. To fit the banners to our objective marker, all you need to do is drill or carve a small hole in the centre just so that our banners can fit through. Now that both of these are complete, let's see how they look on the tabletop. And that's it for another build. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this something that you'll use in your own games? Or is there another piece of terrain type you'd like me to cover? Also, hit that like and subscribe button as it's going to really help the channel grow in a really big way. And if you really like what you've seen, I also have a Patreon page that starts at just $4 a month. This will go a really long way to helping me create new videos that will enhance your tabletop experience. The link for which is in the description below. Patreon members get access to a range of benefits, including the Discord servers, which shows the supporter showcase, which is going to be coming up in future videos, monthly prize draws, credits in these videos, as well as a heap of other benefits as well. Now I wanted to give a huge thank you to our first Patreon show producer, Danny H. Your support means the world to me and I couldn't do it without you. I also wanted to give a huge thank you to our other Patreon member, Mother of Dragons. Once again, thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the other videos on creating banners and making MDF terrain great.